Don't Starve's combat sucks. But that's the point. It's no secret that this game's combat sucks. Attacking is slow and unsatisfying. There are no movement abilities, distance closing moves, heavy attacks, or anything to make fighting things more engaging. Your only abilities are simply hit and walk. Either that or equip some armor, throw a paperweight onto your F key, and hope you have enough healing items to outlast whatever you're chipping away at. That's not to say there aren't some exceptions. A few weapons have a longer range and don't starve together, and there are sometimes ways to get around the monotony of hitting and walking, like the occasional ranged weapon. But the worst thing about Don't Starve's combat is not the psychosomatic pain of the feeling of hitting things with a virtual wet noodle, but instead the way the enemies are animated. Don't Starve takes place in a 3D world with Euler coordinates, and yes, the world is 3D, let's not have that argument again, but the creatures, enemies, and the player themselves are 2D. This means that the animations that play when a creature attacks never truly line up with the actual hitbox that exists in 3D space, to a frustrating extent. There are many examples of this occurring in any Don't Starve game, and it often means there's little way to reliably dodge an incoming attack without simply memorizing the amount of hits you can safely inflict on the enemy in between each attack cycle. In combat, you have very little chance of improvising and reading the incoming attack patterns because of this. Compared to many other games with strongly telegraphed attacks, you often have to go out of your way to read up on how these fights are supposed to be navigated, instead of relying on your personal in-game experience with them, combined with your virtual fighting instincts in the moment.
Every machine has a purpose.
Sorry about interrupting this video already, but I recently put out a trailer for my Don't Starve Together character mod, Wandering Drone. If you have any interest in this character at all, I'd strongly suggest checking it out. It was a lot of fun to try and create some lore, I guess, or backstory for this character. On top of the trailer, the big balance update has come out for the mod. The skill tree has been revamped in many areas, coinciding with community feedback gathered from the last video. This update includes 4 completely new skills that are 2 brand new tapes and 2 new abilities. The media archive has also been completely reworked to be more usable. I'm extremely happy with how the skill trees turned out, and I would really appreciate it if you checked it out. This is a little bit off topic, but there is another Klei game that would suffer from a similar problem, as it also has 2D characters in a 3D world. Rotwood does have a surprisingly effective solution, which is ensuring that all hitboxes actually line up with the animations. The trade-off here is that both players and enemies can only attack sideways, presumably so the animators only have to animate each attack twice instead of like 12 times. At first, this is a bit disorienting, but after playing the game for a little bit, it's easy to forget that it's even a constraint. The combat feels so much better despite suffering from similar restrictions. Obviously, this exact fix wouldn't really be feasible in Don't Starve, since players have the ability to control which way is up by rotating the camera, but I do think it's worth noting that workarounds are within the realm of possibility. The animations and sound effects don't give the combat in Don't Starve a whole lot of gravitas. Attacking enemies feels like slapping them with wet noodles. Every weapon uses the same generic animation, and there are a few unique sound effects, save for the most recent additions to the game. I think it's safe to say that, yes, Don't Starve's combat isn't great. It's slow, dry, and often dull. It sucks. But I'm not here to propose solutions to this problem. In my opinion, the issue doesn't actually lie with the combat system itself, but rather the direction that Don't Starve Together is heading towards nowadays. From the beginning, Don't Starve was never a combat-oriented game. There were originally hardly any boss fights. Dieclops, Ancient Guardian, Spider Queen, and the Tree Guard were the only enemies with enough health to really be considered one. And even then, the latter two are pushing that definition a touch. More often than not, you are strongly encouraged to avoid combat, either by simply running away or by baiting the creatures chasing you into attacking each other. Dieclops, for example, would often end up spawning multiple tree guards due to its forest-destroying tendencies, and the two would then brawl to the death, while the player could observe the battle from a safe distance. Even disregarding boss fights, in day-to-day combat like hound attacks, I often felt that hiding at a pig village or building tooth traps, or even just running away and then coming back to deal with them at a time when I felt more prepared, was more preferable than immediately fighting them myself. And I think that the combat of Don't Starve sucking helps reinforce this. This is a bit of a crackpot conspiracy theory, but I do think it's possible that the game's combat might be bad by design, in order to subtly nudge the player towards seeking out alternate methods of dealing with their foes. Even if it wasn't their intent, it's possible that the devs didn't put as much time into fleshing out the game's combat system if they wanted to incentivize more interactivity between the player and the world. Furthermore, boss fights, or combat, wasn't the be-all end-all of Don't Starve Solo, including its DLCs, as exploration plays a much bigger part in the solo games. In the base game / Reign of Giants, the combat is often intertwined with exploration, such as in the caves and particularly the ruins, which can be quite combat heavy. But the DLC worlds, Shipwrecked and Hamlet, are notably much more focused towards exploration than combat. Shipwrecked's entire thing is exploration. Your starting island will rarely contain the resources needed to progress beyond building a simple boat, meaning that you absolutely must map out the lush tropical archipelago in order to locate rarer resources like gold, or key map locations like all the different biomes and the volcano. Shipwrecked's gameplay loop entirely revolves around exploration. Obviously there is combat, but for the most part it's a relatively minor aspect of the game, as in an average Shipwrecked playthrough you'll be spending much more time exploring than you ever will fighting. Most bosses in this DLC are completely optional to fight, and the usual tactics of leading your aggressors to fight something else often still apply. The biggest exception to this is the Seal Nado, which players are strongly incentivized to defeat due to its very powerful drop and immense strength at destroying player-built structures. But it wouldn't be Don't Starve without a seasonal boss fight to filter out clueless newbies. Hamlet is a similar story, possessing many completely new exploration mechanics, mostly involving the pig ruins which can be explored and exploited for profit. Most interestingly is the way the world in Hamlet is laid out, a series of mountain peaks or plateaus that break the clouds in various locations, splitting the playable world into 5 islands. In order to progress from plateau to plateau, players are required to fully explore the various pig ruins, as they often contain passage to the other islands in the DLC. This is an interesting method of incentivizing exploration, as big portions of Hamlet are completely locked off without it, including the secondary Hamlet where Queen Malfalfa resides. On the combat side of things, these ruins do indeed contain enemies to fight, and I feel like the combat in Hamlet ties in nicely to its explorative nature. It's also worth noting that the boss fights in Hamlet are all completely optional. Even the magic water, which is a valuable revival item, can be stolen from the Fountain of Youth without actually fighting the Pugilisk. Of course, the elephant in the room here is the apocalypse, an inevitable world event that occurs after a set time has passed. The only way to stop it is surprisingly not by beating a certain boss, but instead by locating the apocalypse calendar, contained within an extremely difficult to find secret room inside a ruin on the 5th island. The only way to get to this island is by traversing the lethal gas rainforest using a gas mask. Finding the calendar can be considered the final boss of the Hamlet DLC, as after you've reset it, you have a lot more freedom as to how you experience the world of Hamlet without the ever-looming threat of total annihilation. In that sense, it's sort of the ultimate exploration challenge. Yet again, exploration trumps combat in Don't Starve progression. If you couldn't tell, I love the unique experiences that both of these DLC worlds offer. In general, I have a massive soft spot for games that have more of an emphasis on exploration instead of combat. There's something so invigorating about getting lost in a virtual world. It's that type of experience that plays to the strengths of the video game medium and tell a story in a way that only video games can really do. But as of recent, I definitely can't shake the feeling that Don't Starve Together's updates are straying further and further away from this. Exploration-centered content is seemingly becoming less and less of a priority. I mean, when was the last time they added a new biome, or reinvigorated a less interesting one? Their idea of a cave update in Depths of Duplicity was not to add some more points of interest to the basically completely empty caves, but was instead to add more combat, a new depth worm boss, and a bunch of new enemies that are only accessible post-Rift. The game is also gradually getting a newly renewed focus on progression. In the past, Don't Starve didn't really have a Terraria-style progression at all. Once you had crafted an alchemy engine and a shadow manipulator, you could make almost anything in the game. This goes for all the DLC worlds too. Finding specific resources or key crafting items was locked behind exploring different parts of the world, as we discussed before. But nowadays, things are either locked behind more crafting stations or another boss fight. This style of progression clearly takes a lot of inspiration from Terraria, which is fine, I guess, but it's a completely different style of gameplay than what Don't Starve has come from. For me, it doesn't scratch that same itch. It's not very exciting to read the patch notes for a new update and see that the new content is locked behind yet another boss fight with impossible to dodge attacks that's only encounterable after you play a save for about 50 hours. But the thing is, this style of gameplay would be a lot more bearable if the game was actually designed to accommodate for it. The devs keep adding these more complex boss designs, but half of them don't feel very fun to fight at all, at least to me. It's almost like the game is at odds with itself. At its core, Don't Starve is a game where combat and exploration are harmonious and complement each other, not a game with 1,000 different boss fights where the animations don't line up with the hitboxes. To me, it's clear that the developer's intent has shifted over the years. Don't Starve's combat lacks a lot of the little touches that makes fighting things more satisfying, and there's actually a case of an extra detail in combat being removed from the game. It's unclear when, but in the Don't Starve Together files, there's a more realistic attack animation for the spear that was unused, in which the characters actually poke their enemies with the sharp flint, instead of smacking them with it like a soggy newspaper. This animation is completely finished and completely functional, evidenced by the handful of mods restoring it. The only reason it's not in the game is because Klei decided it didn't fit. But why? The deliberate choice to not include this animation is a very, very interesting fact to me. It means that someone decided that the characters using a spear correctly took something away from the game instead of adding to it. It was like the survivors were combat incompetent Johns and Janes, and the actual combat systems in the game supported that. Between using weapons incorrectly and not having any advanced combat moves to speak of, the game reinforced the idea that the survivors are just that, normal people thrust into an uncomfortable situation. Using unsatisfying combat as a method of storytelling isn't a completely radical idea either. The Binding of Isaac is another game that uses an atypical weapon to communicate this idea, as Isaac's tears are your main way of damaging enemies. There's absolutely nothing flashy or exciting about crying on poop, and yet the Binding of Isaac uses it to great effect to communicate several story themes, namely the character of Isaac's purity and innocence. The actual weapon designs in the game lend themselves to this point as well. Aside from the aforementioned spear, which is a rock tied to a stick, the game's other weapons are pretty bizarre. The Bat, Tentacle Spike, and Cutlass Supreme are improvised weapons made from monster parts. The Thorsight Club is looted from an ancient ruin, and the Morning Star is some kind of crackpot invention. The Cork Bat is a tree branch, and I'd be remiss not to mention the iconic Ham Bat, which is the way it is, and that's okay. In essence, few of the weapons in Don't Starve are normal. They are improvised, experimental, or just downright odd. There are some exceptions to this, like the Dark Sword and the Halberd, but for the most part this theme rings true throughout the game's weapon roster. Except, if you've looked at Don't Starve Together's weapons anytime recently, you'll know that this stylistic choice is all but dismantled. Every recent addition is basically a generic fantasy weapon, themed around either shadows or the piercing lunar light. From my perspective, the weapon designs are a pretty important aspect of the game's identity. I mean, the Hambat is so iconic that it even appears in Team Fortress 2 as a crossover item, even going so far as to attain a meme status of its own isolated within that game. The point here is that the weapons having an improvised or homemade feel builds on the idea of the survivors being helpless, and ultimately the running theme of combat only being an accessory to the survival experience and not the central focus of it. But now, the game is pushing itself to its limit, with every update that adds more boss fights locked behind hours and hours of gameplay, and not something new to explore or get lost in. Don't Starve slowly drifts away from its unique relationship with combat, and towards something a bit more standard for a video game. The problem is not that Don't Starve's combat sucks, it's that the combat is slowly becoming the main focus of the game. Combat is no longer being used to communicate the idea that you're not playing as some calloused combat badass, and that you're instead just playing as some random dope with no idea how to use a spear correctly. It's now the dominant method of interfacing with the game world. In the past, leading enemies to other enemies and letting them maul each other was a legitimate tactic, but now most new boss fights are a lot closer to a 1v1. There are some cases when you can do this, like Fuelweaver's Tree Guard tactic, but this involves going out of your way to summon combatants in an unusual place, not something that may arise organically from just running away. The thing that I personally want to see more of from DST is content like Shipwrecked and Hamlet, updates that fundamentally change the experience to be exciting and thrilling in ways that it wasn't before. The Forge and Gorge were really great examples of this, but they basically don't exist anymore in any official capacity, and Klei doesn't seem interested in making any more events like them for the time being. The current updates sometimes feel like they're designed to be drawn out as long as possible. After several years of continuous character rework updates, we finally reached a point where every character was on par. But now, Klei is slowly adding skill trees to each character, which has reintroduced a lack of parity between them. New survivor-specific content is only ever implemented as part of a skill tree, instead of just being added when it's needed or relevant. And personally, I have no interest in seeing the game receive updates like these in perpetuity. I want new content that doesn't require actual real-life days worth of time investment to even see. I want new content to explore that doesn't require dancing around the game's awkward combat mechanics in order to experience. But above all else, I just want something fresh. There is ample opportunity for something completely new from the current storylines in DST. Let us portal to the Shadow Dimension or something and explore a completely new world. Let Wagstaff hand us an explorable pocket dimension that he needs help fixing. The possibilities are endless. And yet, I bet $10 that the next update will be Werepig boss fight number 3, where he throws shit at you or something. Thanks for watching this video. If you wanted to leave your thoughts in the comments, I'd really appreciate it. I'm definitely keen to see some opinions on what I've said. Sorry to plug it again, but I'd love it if you could give the Wandering Drone mod trailer a watch. It was a lot of fun to create this project. It's been very different to anything I've ever done before, and was quite rewarding to see through to the end. I think, at this point, I view the Wandering Drone mod as finished. I'll try to maintain it via the occasional bug fix, and by writing any missing examination quotes, but beyond that, I think I'm finished developing more content for it. I do have another big project in the works, but it is way too early to say what that is. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.